This is Barbara Hutton. She was one of the wealthiest women in America and indeed the world. Her grandfather started the Woolworth.
On a crisp November evening in 1930, the Ritz-Carlton Hotel in New York City was transformed into a winter kingdom. Ice sculptures towered over pyramids of rare orchids. 4 orchestras played in rotation. Champagne flowed like a river. The city's elite, Vanderbilts, Astors, Rockefellers, gathered under crystal chandeliers to witness the grand debut of a girl who had just turned 18. Her name was Barbara Hutton. Each guest, upon departure, received a velvet box filled with unmounted diamonds. The press called it the most lavish ball of the decade. But beneath the diamonds and champagne was a girl who had once found her mother's body, who had been passed between relatives like an inconvenience, and who would spend her life trying to buy what she never had, love. At that moment, Barbara stood radiant in white silk, a tiara of real rubies in her hair. To the world, she was a fairy tale come true, the poor little rich girl stepping into her kingdom. But fairy tales lie. She would marry 7 times, a prince, a count, a tennis champion, and even Cary Grant, and end her life in a hotel room, nearly blind, nearly broke, and completely alone. In a world that gave her everything money could buy, Barbara Hutton learned, too late, that love cannot be purchased, loyalty cannot be insured, and diamonds, however brilliant, do not warm a cold bed. This is not just the story of a woman who was rich. This is the story of how the richest woman in the world became a prisoner of her own fortune. Shall we begin? Barbara Hutton was born on November 14, 1912, into a family whose name was synonymous with wealth. Her grandfather, Frank Winfield Woolworth, had built one of the most iconic retail empires in American history, the Woolworth chain, and with it, a fortune so vast that it became difficult to measure in mere dollars. Barbara's father, Franklin Laws Hutton, was a partner in E.F. Hutton, one of the most powerful investment firms on Wall Street. Money, in obscene abundance, was a fact of life. But affection, warmth, and emotional security were not. Her mother, Edna Woolworth, was herself a tragic figure, stunning, fragile, and tormented. When Barbara was just 5 years old, she found her mother's lifeless body in their suite at the Plaza Hotel. The cause, suicide, though the family preferred to call it nervous exhaustion. That moment carved itself into Barbara's psyche like a scar that never faded. From that day on, she became not the beloved daughter of privilege, but a symbol of family shame to be hidden, managed, and groomed. After her mother's death, Barbara was handed off to nannies, governesses, and elite boarding schools in Switzerland. Her father was emotionally distant, often absent, and incapable of comforting a child unraveling under the weight of abandonment. Though she was heiress to more than $50 million, a staggering sum at the time, Barbara grew up emotionally impoverished. Her wealth built palaces, but not a home. She entered adolescence with the grace of a porcelain doll and the loneliness of an orphan. Her name opened every door, yet she moved through the grand salons of Europe like a ghost draped in silk, admired, envied, but never truly seen. By the time she came of age, Barbara had already internalized a dangerous belief, that love, like luxury, could be acquired through lavishness. Her guardians ensured she would be equipped for high society, French tutors, etiquette masters, riding instructors, and couture gowns from Paris. She spoke multiple languages, could recite poetry on command, and understood how to glide down a staircase like royalty. But what she never learned was how to feel secure in her own worth. Her self-esteem was as fragile as the bone china that lined her private railway carriage. Barbara wasn't just an heiress. She was a currency. A symbol. A tool. A rumor. A spectacle. Her wealth turned her into a magnet for fortune hunters and a subject of public fascination. The press dubbed her the poor little rich girl, a nickname that at once pitted and mocked her, a phrase that would follow her to her grave. And from this legacy of opulence and abandonment, Barbara Hutton stepped into adulthood believing that only by giving everything could she hope to receive anything in return. It was a bargain the world was all too eager to exploit. Barbara's debut into high society was nothing short of legendary. The infamous 18th birthday ball at the Ritz-Carlton in New York wasn't just a party, it was a coronation. The elite of the Western world, draped in mink and diamonds, gathered to witness the unveiling of an American princess. The ballroom shimmered with $50,000 worth of flowers, the air buzzed with the melodies of 4 orchestras, and waiters weaved through the crowd pouring 2,000 bottles of champagne. Each guest left with a parting gift, a velvet box filled with unmounted diamonds, sapphires, emeralds, and rubies. The entire affair cost more than $60,000, nearly $1.2 million in today's terms. The world looked at Barbara Hutton and saw fantasy fulfilled. But inside, Barbara was already aching. To her, the diamonds were not symbols of triumph, but substitutes for what had never been given freely: love, safety, affection. Soon, the spotlight turned global. She began traveling across Europe, her name whispered in royal courts and private clubs. The European aristocracy, some desperate for cash, others for headlines, saw Barbara as the ideal solution. She had wealth that could resurrect dynasties, and the vulnerability of someone searching for meaning. In Paris, she dazzled in Balenciaga and Schiaparelli, attending state dinners and gallery openings. In Tokyo, she toured imperial gardens in custom kimono, drawing crowds as if she were visiting royalty. In London, she purchased a grand townhouse near Hyde Park and commissioned interiors that rivaled any palace. Her spending was as spectacular as it was relentless: tapestries from the Bourbon courts, Faberge eggs, Chinese jade sculptures, Cartier tiaras. Her homes became museums of excess, scattered across continents. But her true obsession was beauty, not just possessing it, but embodying it. She sculpted herself into an icon, bone-thin, ethereal, almost translucent. She commissioned photographers to capture her in haunting black and white, surrounded by roses, mirrors, shadows. She wasn't living, she was curating an image. A vision. A myth. The world adored her, envied her, and devoured every detail of her life. Magazine covers crowned her the most envied woman in America. Headlines salivated over her purchases, her vacations, her companions. But behind the perfume and pearls, Barbara was disintegrating. Her life wasn't her own, it was a performance. And the applause never reached her heart. Barbara's first marriage came in 1933, barely 3 years after her dazzling debut, to a man whose title gleamed brighter than his love. Prince Alexis Ndavani, a Georgian émigré with noble blood but no fortune, was the first in a long line of men who would see in Barbara not a partner, but a bank account wrapped in silk. The press called them the cash and crown couple. For Barbara, it was the dream she had been raised to chase: a royal title, a fairy tale wedding, and the illusion of eternal love. But behind closed doors, Alexis treated her with icy detachment and barely veiled contempt. He controlled her spending, mocked her insecurities, and kept mistresses without shame. The marriage lasted only 2 years, and when it ended, Barbara paid handsomely for her freedom, just as she would again and again. Next came Count Haugwitz Reventlow, a Danish aristocrat with a temper as cruel as his pedigree was prestigious. Their marriage brought Barbara her only child, Lance, but also her deepest wounds. Haugwitz was emotionally abusive, physically violent, and pathologically jealous. He forced Barbara to relinquish custody of Lance, arguing that her mental instability and lavish lifestyle made her unfit to raise him. The courts agreed. It broke her. Not even the Woolworth fortune could shield her from the devastating ache of losing her son. She descended into self-loathing, numbing herself with cocktails, tranquilizers, and shopping sprees that bordered on manic. Over the years, Barbara married 5 more times: a Hollywood actor, Cary Grant, a Russian prince, a German tennis star, a Dominican diplomat, and a Vietnamese aristocrat. Each union began with lavish headlines and ended in heartbreak. Some took her money. Others took her dignity. All took a piece of her already fragile soul. To Barbara, love became a transaction, and she always paid more than it was worth. She gave men castles, jewels, Rolls-Royces, and oceans of devotion. In return, she received coldness, betrayal, and the echo of her own loneliness. It wasn't that she loved unwisely. It was that she loved desperately, as a child reaching for something soft in a world made of glass. She once said, "When you're rich, they think you have everything. but all I ever wanted was someone to come home to. And yet, each time she opened the doors of one of her gilded mansions, the only sound that greeted her was silence. As Barbara moved further into adulthood, the glitter of her fortune began to tarnish. The very extravagance that once turned heads now raised eyebrows. Her spending habits spiraled into notoriety. She would fly across continents to buy a single painting, gift strangers with diamond brooches, or rent entire floors of hotels just to dine alone in peace. Her generosity, once enchanting, became compulsive, a salve for wounds no one else could see. But it wasn't just money that unraveled. Her health began to falter under the weight of anxiety, alcohol, and pills. Her weight plummeted. Paparazzi started using the word ghostly to describe her. Where once they had praised her elegance, they now whispered about her frailty. Her finances, too, began to disintegrate. Her wealth, though seemingly endless, was not immune to mismanagement and exploitation. Advisors bled her dry through poor investments and personal theft. Ex-husbands and lovers drained millions. Legal fees, lavish expenses, and the absence of restraint slowly dismantled a fortune that once rivaled royalty. More devastating, however, was the emotional erosion. Her son, Lance, had grown distant. Though she had tried to rebuild a relationship with him in his adulthood, the years of separation and his upbringing by a father who despised her had hardened his heart. He viewed her less as a mother and more as a symbol of chaos, a woman who gave everything, except what he needed most. Barbara sought solace in the only way she knew, retreat. She sold mansions, dismissed staff, and shrank her world to a handful of rooms and routine. She lived in hotels, first the lavish kind, then the more modest. She wandered through cities in dark sunglasses, clutching designer handbags too large for her now frail frame. Strangers recognized her name but didn't believe it could be that Barbara Hutton, not the billionaire heiress, not the debutante who had once stopped time at the Ritz. Behind her lay 7 failed marriages, hundreds of millions lost, and a lifetime of headlines that never told the full story. And still, the world looked at her and said, she had it all. But Barbara Hutton had nothing left, except the aching truth that her life had been a spectacle, not a sanctuary. Barbara Hutton died on May 11, 1979, in a suite at the Beverly Wilshire Hotel in Los Angeles, a far cry from the gilded palaces she once called home. She was 66 years old, nearly blind, physically frail, and spiritually exhausted. The room was quiet. No entourage. No velvet gowns. No orchestra in the next room. Just a woman, once richer than most nations, now reduced to silence. At the time of her death, her once immense fortune, estimated to have been over $500 million, had dwindled to less than $3,500 in liquid assets. She had spent, gifted, and lost it all. To some, she was the tragic embodiment of squandered wealth. But to those who looked closer, she was a study in emotional bankruptcy, a woman who had tried to heal abandonment with indulgence, to replace intimacy with extravagance. Her funeral was attended by a handful of acquaintances, a few family members, and more journalists than friends. There were no great tributes, no royal wreaths, no sweeping eulogies. The world had moved on. And in many ways, Barbara had already disappeared long before her body gave out. Even her only son, Lance, inherited not a vast empire, but a tangled legacy of debt and disillusionment. He died just 3 years later, in an airplane crash that only seemed to confirm the family's long-running curse of beauty, brilliance, and ruin. Today, Barbara Hutton is a name remembered more for headlines than humanity. For diamonds, not depth. For scandal, not sorrow. Her image survives in black and white photographs, elegant, ethereal, untouchable, but her story is far more fragile. She lived like a myth and died like a whisper. What remains of Barbara Hutton is not a legacy of business empires or philanthropic triumphs, but something more intangible, and perhaps more tragic. She became a cultural parable, a symbol both envied and pitied, invoked whenever wealth fails to protect against emotional devastation. The poor little rich girl moniker, coined during her youth, clung to her long after her death, not merely as a tabloid invention, but as a prophecy fulfilled. She left behind no empire, no memoirs, no lasting institutions that bore her name. But what she did leave was a question that continues to haunt the glittering halls of privilege. Can a woman have everything and still have nothing at all? Barbara's life, in many ways, was a rebellion against emptiness, a desperate attempt to fill the void left by a mother's suicide, a father's neglect, and a world that saw her more as spectacle than soul. Every mansion purchased, every husband married, every jewel collected was a chapter in her lifelong negotiation with loneliness. In another world, Barbara Hutton might have been a poet, a dancer, or a quiet librarian with soft hands and a garden. But in this world, the world of dynasties and dynamos, of titles and tabloids, she became a commodity of her own fortune. Her story forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about the seductive illusion of wealth, the costs of being seen but not known, and the profound vulnerability that often hides behind the velvet curtains of privilege. She is not just a cautionary tale, nor merely a martyr to money. She is the reflection of what happens when a woman is raised to be everything to everyone, except herself. Now, we turn to you. Do you believe Barbara Hutton was the architect of her own tragedy, or the victim of a world that commodified her from birth? Was she reckless, or merely reaching for something none of us can truly buy? Let us know in the comments below. And remember, behind every diamond lies a shadow.